Well, the Department of Homeland Security says Secret Service agents deleted text messages from the day of the January 6th attack and the day before. The Office of the Inspector General is saying the messages were erased after the Homeland Security Department requested the records as part of its investigation. The watchdog agency says the messages were erased from the system as part of a device replacement program. In a statement, the U.S. Secret Service denies the act was malicious and says the organization has fully cooperated with the Department of Homeland Security. The January 6th committee's next hearing is now tentatively scheduled for prime time Thursday night, July 21st. It'll be focusing on what it calls former President Trump's dereliction of duty during the Capitol insurrection. The committee will examine minute by minute from a pre-riot rally to when President Trump asked protesters to leave the Capitol and go home. This is scheduled to be the committee's last presentation of evidence. The January 6th hearings have really put a spotlight on evidence of plans former President Trump and his closest advisors made to stop or overturn the 2020 elections. And it includes discussions about seizing voting machines from states, even declaring martial law. But the question is, were any of these options even realistic? What kind of power does a president really have? Chris Edelson, fellow at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, joins us now live to try and answer some of these questions. Chris, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks. Nice to be with you.
So I know that you've been watching these hearings closely, as have we, and we've heard some pretty far out ideas during the hearings in regards to the way that the former president and his advisors were trying to stop the 2020 election. So I just asked the question a second ago. Is any of this realistic? Would any of this have been realistic?
Well, it depends on a number of circumstances. Basically, and I don't mean this in a paranoid way, it's just descriptive, presidents can do whatever they want if people are willing to go along with it. In our system in the United States, there are a number of mechanisms that are designed to set limits on presidential power, including the Constitution, including laws, including people who work for them and have to carry out any orders they have. So in theory, all of those things set limits on presidential power. In practice, it depends, as we see in the hearings, of course, as well. It depends on actual human beings enforcing those limits. I think the things that former President Trump planned are not supported by law, but there were people who were willing to go along with them. Of course, there were also people who were not, and the people who objected to what he wanted to do ultimately did win out.
What rules, though, are in place to prevent something like this, a president's abuse of power, from happening?
Well, it's a great question. And James Madison said in the Constitution that, in the Federalist Papers, that the Constitution itself is only parchment barriers unless there's some way to enforce them. It's just words on paper. Again, I don't mean to be paranoid about that. It's just a description, of course. We can write whatever we want on paper. It's only as good as the people who enforce it. We have a Constitution that, in my view, does provide for an effective mechanism of setting limits on anyone's power in government, including, but not limited to, the president. We also have statutes, laws passed by Congress that set limits. All of those things have to be enforced, though. And I think what's most dangerous about what's happened, in my view, and the view of many scholars and people on the January 6th committee, like Congresswoman Cheney, is that we saw former President Trump testing and really going past a number of those limits. And some people took action to stop him, but the people who are best positioned to do so, Republican members of Congress, by and large did not. And that's a really big warning sign to me and to Congresswoman Cheney and other members of the committee.
Well, it was almost like we saw multiple Republican Congress members involved with this trade political favors for presidential pardons. So what about presidential pardons? Is there anyone to check the president when it comes to issuing these pardons?
Well, you're making an excellent point there. If in theory, under the Madisonian system, as it's been amended over the years, if in theory members of Congress set limits on presidential power, what if you have a former president who wants to overturn election results, which unfortunately we did, and there are members of Congress who are not only not setting limits, but they're trying to help him, which may have been the case. That, again, the system depends on people doing their jobs, and we saw some really, really serious warning signs. In theory, there can be limits set on presidential power, including the pardon power. The pardon power is broad, but it's not unbounded. There are limits. There are limits under the Constitution. It doesn't apply to state crimes, for instance. It doesn't apply to impeachment. And there's also some ambiguity. Could a president pardon themselves? It's not clear. Congress has proposed legislation to pass the House that would set some limits on the pardon power. It hasn't passed the Senate, though. And so, again, it depends on members of Congress enforcing limits. And I think at this point, more than a year and a half after January 6th, it's past the time when these limits really should have been set. And I think we're getting to an even more dangerous place for the future, whether it comes to former President Trump or any other president.
You know, it's interesting because you were mentioning the Protecting Our Democracy bill, which did pass the House, but it didn't pass the Senate. Why not?
Well, basically, because the Senate operates under a rule. It's not required by the Constitution, but it's a rule that senators have agreed to and could change at any time, by the way, and sometimes have changed, that requires 60 votes for passage of most legislation. Again, it's not a constitutional rule. It's something that could be changed at any time by simply 50 senators plus the vice president breaking a tie, and it has been done in some cases. But in many cases, including for this bill that you mentioned, the Protect Our Democracy Act, there just aren't enough votes. There are not 50 votes plus one from the vice president to change that rule. So that, I think many observers conclude, I would agree, creates a really difficult threshold. It means that most things in our system require 60 votes in the Senate to pass, a supermajority. That's something that many critics argue should be changed, and it could be changed. There just aren't enough votes right now in the Senate, but it just requires a simple majority.
And Chris, I've got to let you go, but is there anything that can be done in the meantime to make sure that we don't have another situation like this in the future when it comes to future administrations or election cycles?
There absolutely is, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, could join together and they could say, what happened on January 6th was wrong. It's out of bounds. We reject it. We reject anyone, including members of our own ranks who supported it. And we will reject those people from being legitimate actors in the political system. We won't support their candidacies. And we will take steps to strengthen the system through legislation and maybe even changes to the Constitution. Unfortunately, none of those things have happened yet. I think the January 6th committee is trying to push for some of those changes, but as of now, we don't know what will happen. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but I'm not seeing as of now a reason to think that it will.
All right, well, the next hearing is set for prime time this coming Thursday, and I know that you'll be watching closely, as will we. Thank you so much for your time today. Chris Edelson, we appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too.